So today we want to talk about the sixth step on the Noble Eightfold Path, which is Samma Vayama, which pretty much means right or perfect or complete effort. And if you look at the path so far, we've mentioned this before, that traditionally the Noble Eightfold Path is broken into Sila, Samadhi and Panya. But I think a more interesting way of looking at it as three aspects of the whole of the Dhamma. First of all being intellectual training, and then ethical training, and then finally psychological training. So if you look at the path from that point of view, then the first step, right understanding or right view, should be at the beginning, because that's orientating you, that's making it clear to you that you've got to move forward to a particular place or a particular goal. And then the next steps are ethical training, right thought, right speech, right action, and right livelihood. This concerns how you behave, how you speak, how you act, how you interact with other people. And the last three steps are about involving consciousness, how to get your mind in a different state from how it is normally. And that involves meditation and that, which we will talk about next week, but also exerting yourself, actually making an effort. So the reality is that most human beings their lives, most of us, their lives are dominated by craving and desires and wishes and plans and hopes and what have you. And most people go through their life pretty much like that, not thinking too much about their present state, where they're going, what's going to happen to them after death. Somebody who is taking Buddhism seriously starts to think about these things. And one thing that they have to understand is that there is nobody to call upon for help. So in some religions, there's a belief that there is a God or divine being or divine beings. Some religions believe in many gods. And that beseeching those deities or that deity can help you to change, to lead a better life. Now, in the Buddhist understanding, there is no such thing. And so you might say each individual Buddhist is on their own. And some people see this as an aspect of Buddhism which is not particularly attractive. Those who believe in God say, well, it's okay for you, but when you have a crisis, who's there to help you? Well, we could talk about that a little bit later, but there is help. And the greatest help is that as I am a human being, so was the Buddha a human being, and he radically changed himself. He was in many ways perhaps not so different from you and I, but he had an urge, a desire, the enthusiasm to transform himself from what he was to what he could become. That is, a complete and perfect human being. And although he is not accessible to us anymore, because he died long ago, and we cannot pray to him, we are greatly fortunate in that we have a complete guide to how he perfected himself, with all the details that we need so that we could become like him, that is, a complete and perfected human being. And of course, the Buddha's teachings is very, very extensive, but it can all be summed up in one way or another by the Noble Eightfold Path, which is, as we've just said, it involves the intellect, our behavior, and the nature of our mind, how we can change it. So this, we would say, is a complete path, but it's a do-it-yourself path. We could also say that, and we'll talk about this a little more later, that we are a member of, we are participating in a congregation called the Sangha. So, for example, I may know more about the Dhamma than you, or some of you may know more about the Dhamma than I do. And I can call upon you. I can offer what I know to you. So we are not alone in the sense that we are a part of a group that is walking the path together. Each of us can share with and learn from our fellow Buddhists. And this is what organizations like the Buddha Dhamma Mandata Society, the Buddhist Gem Fellowship, and other Buddhist organizations are there for. Places where we can learn, where we can share, and we can benefit from being in fellowship with other Buddhists. So that's it. Anyway, to get to today's subject, the sixth step on the Noble Eightfold Path, right effort. The Dhamma is not going to fall into our laps. We have to actually apply ourselves to these teachings that we have been given. Now, the standard definition of right effort, which is mentioned many times by the Buddha, is this, and I quote it, "And what is right effort? One generates the desire to prevent the arising of unskilled states that have not yet arisen." So that's the first part. One generates the desire to give up unskillful states that have already arisen. That's the second part. One generates the desire to develop skillful states that have not yet arisen. That's the third part. And one generates the desire to nurture and further develop skillful states already arisen. And so that's the fourth part. This is the standard definition of right effort. And we can see it has four parts in it. To recognize, the first part would be to make sure or do what we can not to fall into bad habits. The second part would be to identify negative states of mind that we have, or negative behaviors. Perhaps we are short-tempered, or we're impatient, or something like that, and to see what we can do to modify or eliminate those negative states. Then, of course, it's not all about suppressing and dealing with the negative. It's also about the positive. The next thing would be to identify those positive states that are not a part of our character at present. So, for example, we may recognize that we're perhaps not as kind as we should be, or we're not as patient as we should be. So we identify areas in which we need to grow, in which we need to flourish and better ourselves. And the fourth one is to identify those positive states that we already have and to further enhance them as much as possible. So that involves, each of these states involves making an effort, trying to do something to change the way we are into, to some degree, how we could become. Now, the problem is that sometimes people come to me and they say, "Bhante, I just can't make the effort." And so the thing is, with so many other things, how do you make an effort? How do you generate that energy? This is not an easy question to answer. When people ask me, how can I do it? And I say, well, just do it. I can remember when I was at school, in my high school, and my parents always made sure that I did my homework, but I just couldn't make the effort to do it. It bored me. I wasn't interested. I'd much rather have been watching the TV or reading a book. And I just found it very difficult to apply myself. Now, exactly how you generate that energy to do whatever it happens to be that needs to be done, I'm really not sure that I have the answer to that. And I really don't know too many places where the Buddha has an answer to that. One thing that he does talk about, which comes to mind, is that in several places he talks about the benefits of having good friends, what is sometimes called Kalyana Mitras, beautiful friends. It doesn't necessarily mean physically beautiful. It means beautiful in the sense that they care about you, they're concerned about you, that they like to share things with you, and they have an interest in the Dhamma, like you do have. And one of the things that, or several of the things that the Buddha talks about, what constitutes a good friend, what makes a good friend is, he says, he points out what is good for you. And the second one is he tells you the things that you do not know. And I take this to mean that a good friend can help to motivate you if at present you don't have the determination to motivate yourself. I think another thing that can help you to generate the energy you need to practice the Dhamma is two things. The first thing is contemplating dukkha. If we give some thought, not too much, but give some thought to really what a difficult world we live in. So you and I, probably most of us who are listening to this podcast, have a relatively peaceful and successful life. But you only have to pick up the newspaper every morning to see that there are, in actual fact, millions of people right now whose lives are really like hell. And only a few years ago, they would have never expected that these crises would have come and affected them. So quickly, things changed. It's unlikely that in Singapore and Malaysia, for the foreseeable future, is there going to be any sort of crisis of various types, but you never know. And the other thing is, of course, is that sometimes we become sick. Just recently, as I mentioned earlier, I became really very sick. It came out of the blue. It was, as people say, completely unexpected. The reality is, according to the Buddha, is that we live in a very unstable situation, and we never know when things are going to change. So this can be a motivation to move forward, not to stagnate, because we never know when things are going to change for the better. For the worse. And so this can give us a real appreciation for the many, many benefits that we enjoy. We live in countries that are relatively peaceful, are relatively free, are relatively prosperous, and most people in the world do not live in such places. This is a priceless opportunity for us to use and that we should not squander. So giving some thoughts to this can motivate us to get moving. A second thing is contemplating the Buddha. This has always been easy for me, and this is the reason why, ever since I became a Buddhist, I've been quite fascinated with the personality of the Buddha himself. Whenever I read stories about extraordinary men and women who have made useful contributions to the world, or have developed some wonderful thing for the benefit of the world, or have come forward in times of crisis and helped things to get better, That's always inspired me, reading about the lives of such people. And in the spiritual domain, the person who I've always admired most and been inspired by is the Buddha. Despite the fact that he lived so long ago, we know really quite a lot about him. And everything we know about him seems to suggest that he was an extraordinary person. Coming into contact with him must have been a real blessing for the many people who did. We can't do that now because he is no longer here. But we can read about him. We can think about his achievements. We can contemplate the things that he taught. And the idea that he was an ordinary human being who reached the spiritual heights, and that because we are ordinary human beings, we may be able to do that too. And as the Buddha said many times before, every human being has that potential. It can be done by any human being who practices the Dhamma and makes an effort. These two things, contemplating the negative and contemplating the virtues of the Buddha, I think that this can motivate us to, once again, to get moving, to exert ourselves in practicing the Dhamma. So the Buddha himself, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't say too much about how to actually generate the energy needed, but he does give some interesting guidance on how to apply that energy. Now, as a person who people come to me for guidance about how to practice the Dhamma and what have you, I know quite a lot about this subject. And I often come across people, often young people, who've just become interested in the Dhamma. And my goodness, they are really gung-ho. They want to meditate for 10 hours a day, and they want to, hopefully they can become enlightened in next week, or if not next week, then next month. They're just full of energy. That's good, but it's unrealistic. So what the Buddha did often talk about was that he probably experienced things like I've just experienced, in that people sometimes have a problem at balancing their energy. Either they have too much or too little, or they have sudden bursts and then they find themselves without any energy, and then they make double their effort to make up for the time that they didn't make an effort, and so on. And concerning this, the Buddha does give some useful advice. It's not sufficient to make an effort. What is needed is a balanced effort. Probably most of you know the famous story where there was a particular monk who was overreaching himself, making such an effort and not really moving ahead, and being frustrated and deciding basically to give up. So the Buddha came to know about his predicament, called him to come and see him, and he mentioned to him, well, am I right in saying that before you became a monk, you were quite good at playing the lute? And the monk said, yes, indeed he was. And he said, well, when you tighten the strings too tight, was the music melodious and beautiful? And he said, no. Well, when the strings were too loose, was the music nice then? He said, no. And he said, is it not the case that the strings had to be just very sensitively balanced in the middle, not too loose and not too tight? The monk said that yes, it was. And then the Buddha advised him, well, see if you can get your level of energy like that. Not overwrought, not too slack, but balanced in the middle. In another place, the Buddha uses what I think is a really lovely analogy. He says that practicing right effort is like catching a quail by hand. Some of you may know a quail is a little bird that lives in long grass. And he said you can imagine somebody catching a quail by hand. If he held it too tight, he would squeeze it to death. If he didn't hold it tight enough, it would fly through his hands and escape. So this requires not just making an effort, but being sensitive to whether or not our energy is finely balanced, just as we need it. Now, I have used this analogy on this business about balancing energy. I think like walking the Noble Eightfold Path is like rowing a boat. So imagine that you're in a boat and you're rowing because you want to get up the river, and the currents are changing all of the time. So sometimes you need to pull both the oars with the same amount of energy. But then you might find that the boat is going a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. So now you have to pull less on this one and more on that one. And then you may notice that sometimes now the current is carrying you along. So you really don't have to make an effort anymore. You can just put the oars up and allow yourself to be carried along by the current. But then you may find that you notice up ahead there are rocks and that which you have to avoid. So now you really have to pull on the oars in order to avoid getting hit by the rocks. In other words, you need to be sensitive to your situation, the situation around you the whole time, and adjust your energy accordingly. So I think that this is a good analogy for how to develop and to maintain balanced energy, so that your output of energy is practical and useful and doesn't create problems. Other than that, I don't think there's really too much more we can talk about concerning right effort. Maybe one other things that we could say is, and this is a point that I like to make because it is very, very important, and it comes back to a very serious misunderstanding in Buddhism. So I've considered this problem so serious that I recently wrote a book on it, and the book is called Good Karma, Bad Karma, What Exactly is Karma? And over the years, I've noticed that I've read in books, I've heard monks giving sermons, claiming that everything that happens to you in your life is due to your past karma, to something that you did. There are many things that can cause the things that happen now. One of them is karma, but it is certainly not the only one. Now, if we think about it, if everything that happens to us is due to our karma, and if that is so, why on earth would the Buddha teach right effort? If you were successful in your meditation, that's because of something you did in your past. If you couldn't meditate well, that's because of something you didn't do in your past, and so on. The mere fact that one of the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path is right effort should tell us that this idea that everything that happens to us is due to our past karma, it should tell us that this idea is false, it is wrong, it is not correct, and it was not taught by the Buddha, and we need to understand that because we are told this so often, and it's really time we came to terms with it. One of the reasons why right effort is one of the steps on the Noble Eightfold Path is the very idea that we do and we can change what we did in the past or what we have done just recently. Anyway, that's all I've got to say for this afternoon. It is not really as long as our normal talks, simply because they're the main things that I can think about. So if there's anything anybody would like to ask or talk about concerning right effort, Samma Vayama. Please ask and I'll do my best to answer your questions.
Hi, Wendy. Nice to see you again. Hope you recover from your illness.
Thank you. I'm feeling better. I haven't fully recovered, but I'm feeling better. Yes. What did you want to ask?
I want to ask. The first thing is, in the chapter of the how to abandon the unwholesome states, I think in that part, from what I read, there are a lot of details which including replacing with good thoughts. Try to think about the bad things about holding that thoughts, and try to bear with it, tolerate it, like grinding the teeth and those things, or look at thoughts as if it's a thief so that you won't get disturbed by it, and or just ignore it. Would you be able to probably explain a little bit to us about the details, how to apply it practically in our life?
Okay, so you're referring to the Vitakka Santana Sutta, yes?
I actually don't know which part, but I always, when I read about this part, I always think about this part of the right effort to how to abandon the unwholesome thinking or emotion which we have in our mind.
Yeah, right. So this is called the Vitakka Santana Sutta, where the Buddha talks, I think, about its 5 ways to silence your thoughts. Okay, so before answering that, we perhaps have to talk a little bit about meditation. There are different types of meditation. So I think we can classify meditations as 3 types according to how we relate to our mental activities, thoughts. So one type of meditations are about stopping thinking. Another meditation is about utilizing thoughts. And a third type of meditation is about just observing the processes of thinking. Okay? So in the first type, say certain types of meditation, the whole high purpose of this is to stop mental activity. Now, the reality is that this is not easy. And anybody who's ever tried to do it will know this. But however, it can be done, and it usually requires fairly significant changes in your normal life. In other words, it's types of meditation that were taught for and practiced by monks who were spending a lot of time in solitude. Okay, so anybody who has ever tried to do this will notice that if you've spent a lot of time during the day talking, you find that your mental activity when you're trying to meditate is just overwhelming. In other words, there seems to be a connection between verbal activity and mental activity. Now, monks who are living in the forest in solitude and that, where perhaps they don't talk to anybody or say virtually nothing to anybody for weeks on end, trying to stop their mental activities, trying to stop their thoughts is fairly easy. Even then, it takes time and effort and determination, but it can be done. For the ordinary person living in an ordinary life, it is not easy at all. And that's why I think so many people start meditation thinking, oh, I've got to stop thinking. And 3 weeks later, they think, man, this is never going to work. It's very, very difficult. So that's the first type of meditation. The second type of meditations are utilizing thoughts. Okay, so metta bhavana would be an example of using thoughts. You deliberately think particular types of thoughts. You think about somebody you love and you radiate particular thoughts towards them, positive thoughts towards them, and so on. The recollections, recollecting the Buddha, the Dhamma, or the Sangha, these would be examples of using thoughts to transform your mind. Okay, Anybody who has ever done metta bhavana or any of the recollection meditations will find that this is easy. And the third type is watching thoughts or just observing thoughts. And this is what you would call mindfulness of breathing. Now, when people think that the most important type of meditation is stopping thinking, stopping the process of mental activities, they always use their breath. And they think that but if they looked at the word anapanasati, it's not stopping thinking, it's sati, being mindful of or watching your thoughts. And in this meditation, a person will use something like their breath, and they will simply not try to control their thoughts, not try to encourage them, not try to discourage them, but simply watch them. I use the analogy of buying a mango. Now, I don't know how you buy a mango, but this is how I go about a mango. I go to the market, and there are the mangoes in front of me, and I pick up one and I look at it and squeeze it. And, it's a nice color, and then I put it down and I pick up another one and I look at it and observe it. It's a nice big one. How much are these ones? Okay, 10 ringgit, not bad. Put it down, pick up another one. That's how you practice mindfulness of breathing. That's how you observe or watch thoughts. You simply calm yourself down, you watch your breath, and when a thought comes, you briefly examine it, put it down, go back to your breath. It's not a competition. You're not trying to think, stop thinking. You are simply watching mental activity. Another analogy I use is I use the analogy of the, what do you call it, the Champs-Élysées. You know what the Champs-Élysées is? Okay. It's one of the main streets in Paris. So all the best shops are on the Champs-Élysées. And there are lots of cafes along on the pavement. It's a wonderful place. I recall when I first went to Paris, I stayed with my brother, and one afternoon we went to the Champs-Élysées and we sat on a cafe on the sidewalk and drank coffee. I mean, what could be more wonderful than that? And we sat and we talked, and I was new to the city, so I was just watching the people coming and going. And also, everybody's dressed so nicely because it's a really good street, And all sorts of people, very elegantly dressed people, and gentlemen very well dressed, and women with their dogs, and so on and so forth. And because we were sitting together, and that we just talked and talked and talked and talked, and gradually the sun went down, and etc. And we just sat there and watched the people go past. And as the night got a little bit longer, and the waiters kept on looking at us and wondering when we were going to leave, there were less and less people. And by the time we were ready to leave, there was virtually nobody there. The street had become silent, quiet. And I take this as an analogy as how to practice mindfulness of breathing. That is, you simply watch the flow of thoughts coming and going. You don't try to control them. You don't try to say, oh, look at that man. Why is he dressed like that? Why has that woman got a dog? No, you don't do that. You simply sit there and watch this parade of thoughts, most of them really bizarre and of no value whatsoever. It's like a bric-a-brac shop. There's all sorts of junk. But you don't judge. You simply become a still center watching these activities. And if you learn to do this with patience, etc., in time, you find they simply just stop by themselves. Okay, now to return to your question, that sutta, the Vitakasantana Sutta, that is for advice for people who are spending a lot of time in solitude, where actually stopping the process of thinking is the main goal. I don't think that that is very useful for the average non-monk meditating. Okay, so that's what I'd say about this. However, there are several things in that sutta which I think are interesting. And the last one is, as you very correctly said, you can try to grit your teeth and use your determination. Yeah, sometimes that works. Another one is you try to replace a negative thought with a positive thought. That can be useful too. That sometimes works. But the last one is, what's the last one? Do you remember? You told me?
You can watch it. You try to watch and look at it like really mindfully, as if it's a thief, so that it won't disturb you.
Yeah. Well, no, the last one is the Buddha says, just ignore it.
And just ignore it. Another one is ignore it.
Yeah. Now this is a very interesting thing. If you through life, you may notice that sometimes the harder you try to do something, the more difficult it is to do. And then you think, oh, damn it, I give up. And then suddenly it just happens. The Taoist sages were aware of this, the value of doing nothing, of just leaving it alone, giving up, you might even say. And sometimes you find, whoops, it just happened. Sometimes simply making an effort makes it more difficult to get what we want. And yet this is called, in psychology, this is called paradoxical intention. That is, you do the very opposite of what you think is the right thing to do. And this requires sensitivity and knowing just when to do this. But it's interesting that the Buddha did actually mention that. Anyway, the short answer is that that's what I could say about that sutta, the Vitakasantana Sutta. It's primarily concerning practices done by people, usually monks, who are spending a lot of time in complete silence. And therefore, that's why they do that practice. It's probably not so useful for somebody like yourself. Okay, that's it. I hope that was useful. Any other questions anybody has?
Yes, thank you for the answer. This next question is from Kay. Would we still be able to practice successfully if we live alone in solitude, estranged from family and no friends?
Okay, so yes, of course. And even today, there are monks who live in relative solitude. But it's very interesting. In the Anguttara Nikaya, there is a discourse which the Buddha delivers to some monks, and he says this, that those who go into solitude may rise to the top or sink to the bottom. And that's one of the most interesting things he said about solitude. Solitude can be good at a certain stage in your practice, at a certain stage in your life, or for a certain type of person. Generally speaking, I think that for the average non-monk, I think solitude short periods of solitude, I think can be very useful for people. Extended periods, I think that requires some spiritual maturity. And I think this is why the Buddha said that his actual words were, when you go into solitude, you may rise to the top, meaning that you may benefit a great deal, or you may sink to the bottom where you don't benefit at all. You become lonely, uncaring, perhaps too crabby and unused to dealing with other people and things like that. I know in my years in Sri Lanka, I used to visit and sometimes stay in aranyas. These are forest monasteries where people go there usually to live in relative solitude. And I always notice that you get some of the best monks there, really serene, peaceful, joyful people, and you meet other people who don't seem to have spiritually developed very well at all occasionally. Solitude, like other spiritual qualities, solitude has got, it can have benefits at the right time, in the right place for the right person, or perhaps not. The mere fact that the Buddha recommended friendship so frequently of all human relationships, the Buddha talked about friendship more than any other. That suggests to me that he thought that for many people, long periods of isolation from others is not good for them. Generally speaking, I think we human beings are social animals. We do well in the company of others, in the right type of company. And so that's what I think on that. It's a double-edged sword. Solitude can be very useful, or it may not be helpful at all, depending on the individual. Anything else?
Next question is from BDMS, Diana. It's not related to the topic, and I'll read out the questions regarding Dr. Ambedkar's revival of Buddhism in India. I read that it had led to a new Buddhist movement called Navayana, in which the Four Noble Truths were reinterpreted in the context of social struggles. Is Navayana still considered Buddhism, as it appears that the movement lacked international Buddhist support and recognition?
Well, Dr. Ambedkar was quite a remarkable person, and he was the leader of probably the most persecuted people in the world, probably the most persecuted people in history. And he dedicated his life to uplifting them, helping them to get out of the terrible conditions that they were in, the untouchables of the Indian caste system. So in the end, he decided that it would be best if they left Hinduism, because it was Hinduism that was creating the problems for them. And he thought that the best, he examined quite a lot of different religions, Islam and Christianity and some other religions. And in the end, he decided that he thought that Buddhism was best, that it would be most, it would inspire people, it would give them the confidence and self-respect that they needed, and it would hopefully help them to progress socially. And for that, he felt that it might be necessary to modify some aspects of the Dhamma. And you mentioned some things that he taught. My personal opinion is that the Buddha's Dhamma has been interpreted in many different ways over the centuries, and that Ambedkar's interpretation of the Dhamma was no more radical than quite a lot of others. As it so happens, it has helped this community progress to some degree in India. But I think the majority of people don't necessarily practice everything that Ambedkar taught. There are many different Buddhist communities in India today. Quite often they just practice and accept normal, the type of Dhamma that most other people do. Others adhere quite closely to Dr. Ambedkar's teachings. My personal feeling is that I wouldn't agree with everything that Ambedkar advocated, but I think that there is room for different interpretations of the Dhamma in order to solve different human problems. He was not teaching people to attain nirvana. He was teaching people to use the Dhamma to develop self-respect and uplift themselves, etc. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think that Bhimrao Ambedkar was the greatest Indian in the modern times. I think he was an extraordinary individual, but I don't agree with everything that he taught. But that's quite irrelevant to the Noble Eightfold Path. Any questions concerning right effort?
I think there's a follow-up from Kay regarding her questions where on living in solitude. The feedback, the follow-up is, thank you, Bante, but I don't think I am able to find good Kalyana Mitra. Nevertheless, living solitude, I have looked after myself. As a result, my mind is distracted with dealing with daily activities. As your example about choosing a mango in the shops, I will want to choose a good looking mango. This is in a way to God because the desire is get a good looking mango is strong because I don't want to pick any mango and be contented with any mango. So in a way, I find that my mind is never at peace for long because having to deal with the daily activities. I do admit that the only way to practice well is to lead a monastic life, which unfortunately I don't think I am ready for it. As a result, I often feel dejected. Can Bante give some encouragement, please?
Well, you know yourself much better than I do. Living with other people or being in contact with other people can be a bit of a nuisance sometimes. Somebody once said, hell is other people. So, well, if you feel that you would flourish better like that, then I would encourage you to spend more time by yourself. But keep an eye on yourself also. And maybe even ask yourself, if you can't get along with other people, is it other people or is it the problem with yourself? You understand? But I'm not here to give advice on individual spiritual practice because I simply don't know anything about you. But what I did say, I think it would be worth keeping that in mind. But at the same time, you know yourself better than I. If you feel that you would do better spending more time in solitude and silence, then go ahead and see how it goes. That's all I can say. Anything else? Maybe before we finish.
There's no more questions regarding today's topic, but there's questions about 7 factors of enlightenment. Do we want to take that up, Bante?
Okay, then. Okay, let's have it.
Okay. The question is very simple. Could Bante please explain about 7 factors of enlightenment?
Okay. Okay, now I've got to try to remember what they are. So there are different programs, you might say, that the Buddha taught apparently at different times and to different people. So one of them is the 7 factors of enlightenment. Can you tell me what the 7 factors of enlightenment are, those who asked the question? Yeah, okay. Kai Yan, thank you. What's the first one?
The first one is mindfulness. The second
Right.
one is Dhamma Vichaya. The third one is
Right.
Viriya. And
Right.
fourth is Piti. Then
Right.
followed by Pasadi and Samadhi and Upekkha.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that reminder. Okay, so you can see here you've got a range of qualities, spiritual qualities, which the Buddha says that looked at from one point of view, these would be 7 qualities that would move you closer towards enlightenment. So the first one is mindfulness. We've already talked about that. The second one is Dhamma Vicaya. This is pretty much, we talked about that too. That would be examining the mangoes. Dhamma Vicaya is looking at or exploring Dhammas, and that usually is interpreted as thought processes. What was the third one again?
Virya, energy.
Okay, we talked about that too. Energy, we talked about that today. Next one.
Piti.
Piety and passaddhi, these two come together. I think these are very important. Piety means generally joy or ebullient feeling, and passaddhi means serenity or stillness. And the last one is upekkha. So these three together, I think, are really very important, particularly with anybody who's practicing meditation. People sometimes ask me, how can I know that the technique that I'm using is the right one, or whether it's the right one for me? And I always say that there are 2 or 3 qualities which can help you know that what you're doing the right technique in the right way, and piti and passaddhi are 2 of them. If you're meditating and you're becoming morose and unsmiling, and you've lost your sense of humor, and you're grim, and the whole world is dukkha, and look at that beautiful flower, yeah, but it'll be dead tomorrow. Chances are, I think your meditation's not doing very well. A sign that your meditation is doing well is that you are perhaps more peaceful and more joyful than you were before you started doing the meditation. I think that's one of the best indications that your practice is going okay. And the other one is the ability to be more objective and honest to yourself about yourself. That is, you can identify and accept perhaps negative aspects of your character, and at the same time you can identify and rejoice in positive aspects of your character as well. In other words, I think that the ability to know your inner life, your character, and to be objective about it, I think that's a very good sign that your meditation and your spiritual practice is going well. So anyway, there are other formulas that the Buddha used for our spiritual development. For example, in the Samanyapala Sutta, where the Buddha gives a step-by-step account of how to progress in the spiritual life, which is different from the 7 factors of enlightenment. So there are various ways of looking at it. One of them is the 7 factors of enlightenment, which I think is really quite a good one.
Yeah. One day.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
can I say?
Yeah.
Actually, I thought this topic is related to the today's topic because the right effort from one part of it is to arouse the wholesome state, which some people think the wholesome state, it actually, one of it is 7 factors of enlightenment. So do you agree with that?
I wouldn't disagree with that, eh?
Yeah. And what I wanted to ask about the 7 factor of enlightenment is it some stepwise kind of things? It means you must have the investigation, the mindfulness investigations, and only you have the energy, and only then you have the
I don't think it's a one after the other thing. I think it's a part of a whole package. In fact, the whole of the Noble Eightfold Path is like that too. I see the Noble Eightfold Path like this, is that, so some people think you do this one first, and then after you finish that, you do that one, and after you do this one, you do this one. I don't think any of the practices are like that. I see it as like a rope or a string going from one side of the room to another. So the string itself goes from one side of the room to another. But if you look at each of the twines in the string, no piece of fiber is longer than that. They're all twisted together, and together they make a from here to there. but within themselves, each of them is quite individual and nowhere near as, not one fiber goes from here to there. They're all utilized together. That's as I see the path, and I see the 7 factors of enlightenment as the same.
Thank you, Pandit.
I would, if you're interested in this subject, read the Samanyapala Sutta. It's the second discourse in the Digha Nikaya. I think Maurice Walsh's translation is a very good one. And I think that gives a really very detailed, sensible account of the different stages that anybody who is taking the Dhamma seriously should practice. I think it starts with, if I remember correctly, it starts with faith. And then it moves on to taking the refuges, usually in terms of becoming a monk. Then it refers to developing the sila, and then it refers to becoming mindful in your daily life. Then it refers to suspending or overcoming, temporarily, overcoming the 5 hindrances. And when the Buddha talks about overcoming the 5 hindrances, he talks about it in a very interesting way, that what happens is that overcoming or being able to suspend temporarily the 5 hindrances makes you feel very positive, give you a sense of purpose. It makes you feel a sense of relief, a feeling of liberation, of being free from these awful states of mind, etc. And that building once again on that joy, that's what starts to bring success in meditation. So if you actually read the Samanyapala Sutta, it's easily available in Walsh's translation. You might find that that's an interesting way of looking at the step-by-step process of moving from conditioned to unconditioned state. Have a look at it.